I never thought a broken blender could feel like the start of a story I wasn't ready to tell. But there I was, standing in the cramped corner of the appliance repair shop, the fluorescent lights buzzing above me, clutching a half-disassembled coffee maker as if it could explain everything. She appeared from behind the counter like she always did, confident, deliberate, moving with that quiet command of a person who's entirely comfortable in her own skin. Not in a loud, overbearing way, but in the kind that makes the air subtly heavier, as if you notice everything she doesn't need to say. Her name's Mara. She's in her mid-40s, impeccably dressed in soft linen that somehow made her look both approachable and untouchable at the same time. I don't know why I always notice the little things. How her wristwatch catches the light when she gestures, the faint scent of coffee, and something else, warmer, lingering behind her. I'd come here a dozen times, but this afternoon felt different. Maybe it was the way she looked at me as I struggled with the tiny screws on the blender. Or maybe it was just the way she made me feel like I was fumbling through a world where she already knew all the rules. I think it's just the motor, I said, my hands shaking slightly, not from the weight of the appliance but from the heat of her gaze. Mara didn't answer immediately. She leaned over, resting one elbow on the counter, her eyes sliding down to the blender, then back up at me. The pause wasn't uncomfortable, it was electric. Something unspoken passed between us, and I couldn't tell if it was curiosity or amusement or something heavier, something that made my stomach tighten for no reason. "Be careful," she said finally, her voice softer than I expected. Not a command, not a joke, just a note. And somehow, it sent a ripple through me, like the first chord of a song I didn't know I'd been waiting for. I laughed nervously, fumbling the screws into my pocket. "Yeah, I always am," she smiled, just a small, sideways curl of her lips. But it was enough to make me forget the mess of wires and metal in front of me. I wanted to ask her about it, about that smile, but the words caught somewhere between my throat and my ribs. And then she was gone, leaving a small trace of coffee-scented warmth where she had been, her presence folding into the rhythm of the shop. I leaned against the counter, trying to focus on the blender, but my mind kept drifting back to her. How her eyes lingered on me a fraction too long. How her hand had brushed the edge of the counter as she adjusted some paperwork. How? And then, just as I was about to leave, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned, expecting another repairman, but it was her cousin, someone I'd met once before, holding the hem of my shirt gently but firmly. "Stay with me instead," he said. His voice was casual, but the weight behind it made my heart jerk in a way that didn't make sense. I glanced back toward where Mara had disappeared, and for a moment, I could almost feel her watching me, as if she'd left something unspoken in that small space between us, something that I couldn't stop thinking about. And just like that, the day, normal, ordinary, fix-a-blender kind of day, felt like the very beginning of something I wasn't sure I was ready for, but couldn't ignore. The next time I saw Mara, it was in her apartment. Not because I was invited. She had called me over to help fix a stubborn dishwasher that apparently had a mind of its own. The smell of lemon cleaner and old pipes hit me the moment I stepped inside, and the low hum of the refrigerator made the quiet almost heavier than the silence outside. She stood by the counter, sleeves rolled up, hair tucked behind one ear. Her movements were precise, almost mechanical, as she rinsed a few glasses. I wanted to ask how her day had been, but the words felt wrong. Instead, I knelt beside the dishwasher, tools in hand, pretending I was completely focused on the mangled wiring inside. She didn't speak much. That was Mara's way, an invisible wall I was never sure I'd be allowed past. And I didn't press. I watched. Her hands, strong and elegant, moved with an economy that made the simplest task seem deliberate. The faint tremor in her fingers when she leaned over the counter caught my attention, and I held my breath, unsure why it mattered to me. "You really think this will work?" she asked, finally breaking the silence. Her voice was quieter than usual, almost fragile. I looked up to see her eyes flicking toward mine, but quickly darting away, leaving a trace of something unspoken in the air between us. I think so," I said, keeping my tone casual, though my heart had decided to race ahead without warning. She gave a short laugh, sharp but tired. I noticed the small crease near her eye, the one that deepened when she forced herself to smile instead of letting herself falter. There was a vulnerability there, fleeting, like a candle flickering against a draft. And for a brief moment, I wanted to reach out, brush her hair back, tell her it was okay to just be tired, to just pause. But I didn't. Instead, I handed her a screwdriver she had been eyeing for too long. Our fingers brushed. The contact was brief, almost accidental, but enough to make the air between us feel heavier. I could feel her stiffen slightly, her lips parting as if she wanted to say something, and then didn't. The dishwasher made a metallic groan, and we both paused, listening. In that pause, she shifted closer to the counter, resting her weight on one hand, her other hand rubbing her temple. A subtle sigh escaped her lips, barely audible, but it carried a weight I couldn't name. I wanted to ask her if she was okay. I wanted to break the careful control she held over every inch of herself in that space. But all I did was glance at her, noticing how her shoulders curved inward, how tired she looked beneath the composed surface. And then, as if sensing my gaze, she finally looked at me. Not with her usual guarded calm, but with a fraction of hesitation that spoke of something deeper, something she wasn't ready to admit, maybe even to herself. I smiled faintly, letting the silence speak for both of us. She returned it, brief, hesitant, almost apologetic. And for a moment, the small, quiet room felt like it had expanded, holding only the two of us and the tiny, fragile energy vibrating between us. Then she leaned slightly over the counter, brushing past me to grab a dish towel, and our shoulders touched. Just that, light, accidental, fleeting, but enough to leave a spark in its wake, something neither of us could name yet, but both of us could feel. I stepped back, pretending to adjust a pipe, but my eyes stayed on her. And when she finally glanced at me again, I caught a flicker, a soft, charged hesitation in her expression, and I knew I'd be thinking about it long after I left. It was late, later than either of us had planned. The repair was finally done, and Mara had insisted I stay for a cup of tea. The storm outside made the apartment feel smaller, more intimate. The rain tapping against the windows, the low rumble of thunder, the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the room in brief, stark bursts. We sat across from each other at her small kitchen table, two steaming mugs between us. I kept my hands wrapped around mine, feeling the warmth seep in, noticing how hers were wrapped loosely around her cup, fingers just brushing the ceramic edge. She didn't speak much, just letting the rain and the silence fill the spaces. But every so often, her eyes would flick to me, and for a second, the guarded distance softened. "Do you ever feel like some things are just too complicated?" she asked quietly, almost to herself. I wanted to answer differently than I should have. I wanted to say, "I feel that way with you," but I didn't. Instead, I nodded, careful not to lean too close, careful not to let the words, or the weight behind them, slip out. Her laugh came next, soft, a little breathless, when the wind rattled the window pane. It wasn't funny, not really, but it held a vulnerability, a small fracture in her usual composed exterior. I wanted to reach across and steady her hand, or brush a strand of hair from her face, but I stayed still, just watching, memorizing. Then her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced down, hesitated, then sighed, and I knew instantly it was someone she didn't want to speak with right now. Maybe an ex, maybe a friend with questions she wasn't ready to answer. She silenced it, but the pause, the way her eyes flickered away from mine, felt like a reminder that the world outside our little bubble existed, and it could intrude at any moment. I leaned forward slightly, as if to offer comfort, but stopped myself. My arm hovered above the table for a moment too long before I let it drop back to my side. The restraint was heavier than the storm outside, pressing down on my chest, making my fingers itch to do something, anything, to bridge the gap. At one point, she reached for the sugar bowl, and our hands collided. Just briefly, just the tips of our fingers brushing, but the current it sent through me was anything but brief. I looked up, and she met my gaze, not with her usual cool precision, but with a flicker of hesitation, of something unspoken, of a pull she wasn't ready to acknowledge. Thunder rolled again, closer this time, and the room seemed to shrink even further. I wanted to say something, to bridge the silence with a confession, or even just a whisper, but I couldn't. I could only sit there, breathing, memorizing the curve of her jaw, the faint tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes flicked away the instant they held mine too long. And then, almost instinctively, we both leaned forward at the same time, closing the distance just enough that our knees brushed beneath the table. The moment stretched, suspended in the quiet storm, and I could feel the near impossibility of it, the tiny, impossible pull between us that neither of us dared to name. Then, just as quickly, the moment broke. Her hand froze mid-motion, my own pulled back, and the storm outside seemed suddenly louder, sharper, reminding us both that some things weren't ours to claim yet. But I couldn't stop thinking about it, about how close we had been, about the electric hesitation that lingered in the air long after our knees had separated. The apartment was quiet that evening, the storm long gone, but the air still heavy with the weight it had left behind. Mara was perched on the edge of the sofa, knees tucked close, hands clasped loosely around them. I sat across from her, leaning back in the armchair, pretending to read a manual for a small appliance I didn't need to fix. But neither of us was fooled. Her eyes flicked to mine more often than before, and each time, it felt like a question I wasn't ready, or allowed, to answer. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice low, hesitant, almost reluctant. What are we doing?" The words hit me like a sudden gust of wind. Not because they were romantic, but because they were raw, exposed, impossible to ignore. She wasn't asking about me or her. She was asking about the space between us, the tension, the hesitations, the unsaid things that had piled up over weeks. I swallowed, feeling the pull of everything I wanted to say and everything I couldn't. My hands twitched in my lap. I don't know," I admitted, quieter than I thought I could manage. She exhaled slowly, a faint tremor in her shoulders, and for a moment, I caught the fatigue in her eyes, the exhaustion of holding herself together, of keeping a distance that I could feel but not cross. "It feels wrong, maybe," she said. "But also, like maybe it's too late to pretend it isn't happening." I wanted to reach out, to touch her hand, to steady her, but I didn't. Instead, I let the silence hang, letting it speak in ways words couldn't. Every small movement she made, the brush of her fingers along her jeans, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the quick blink before looking away, became a conversation I wasn't allowed to finish. "Sometimes I think I shouldn't be here," she said finally, voice barely above a whisper. And then she paused, and the pause carried more weight than any sentence could. I nodded, understanding without needing to confirm it aloud. The room felt smaller, intimate in a way that made my chest tighten. I realized I had been holding my breath without noticing, my gaze locked on the slight curve of her jaw, the way her lips pressed together as if to stop herself from saying more. I don't want to hurt anyone," she added, and the words were like knives, sharp with vulnerability, with fear, with the weight of responsibility I had never expected to feel. I didn't answer. I couldn't. What could I possibly say that wouldn't make it worse? Instead, I watched her, memorizing the subtle tremor in her hands, the quiet strength she tried to summon, the raw honesty she couldn't disguise. She shifted, hugging her knees closer, and I realized the space between us wasn't just physical. It was the accumulated weight of unspoken truths, of a pull neither of us could, or should, resist. And then she looked at me, her eyes glistening with something fragile, something that wasn't anger or accusation, but something worse, hope tangled with fear, longing wrapped in hesitation. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, the words dropping into the quiet room like stones in water. I wanted to reach out. I wanted to tell her it would be okay, but I didn't. I just sat there, listening to her confession, feeling the silent explosion of everything we hadn't yet dared to name. And in that moment, I realized the most devastating truth. Maybe some things couldn't be fixed, not with tools or words or careful distance. Maybe some things were already too heavy to carry, and all we could do was sit in the silence and let it speak. I showed up at her apartment that evening without any real reason, just the sort of habit that had crept into my days without me noticing. The air smelled faintly of lavender and old books, a combination that somehow made her feel more present, more fragile. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor, sorting through a small stack of letters tied with a ribbon. Her fingers lingered over the paper, tracing lines I couldn't read. When she looked up, her eyes caught mine, and I noticed how tired they seemed, like they'd carried too many yesterdays. "I wasn't going to show you this," she said, voice low, almost reluctant. "But maybe you should know." I leaned against the doorframe, silently encouraging, though the quiet made the room feel heavier. She handed me a folded letter, and I hesitated, aware of the intimacy of the gesture. The paper was worn, edges frayed, ink slightly smudged. I could tell it had been read and reread 1,000 times. "This is from someone I lost," she said, voice catching slightly. "Years ago. I thought I'd moved on, but some days it just—" Her hand trembled, and she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "It hits again." I nodded slowly, not knowing exactly what to say. I could feel her vulnerability like a current in the room, and for the first time, the barrier she always held up seemed thinner, almost permeable. I didn't mean for you to see this," she added, eyes flicking away. "It's just, sometimes you're here, and it feels like I could. I don't know, say something, and it wouldn't sound crazy. But then I remember." I didn't interrupt. I watched her fingers linger over the ribbon, over the familiar script, the hesitation in her posture telling me everything she wasn't saying. And in that moment, I felt something shift, a weight I hadn't noticed pressing down on both of us. I tried to offer something in return, something gentle. "I know it's hard," I said quietly, "but it's okay to remember. You're allowed to." She looked at me, a flicker of surprise crossing her face, like she hadn't expected that from me. Not the words, not the quiet understanding. And then her lips quirked into a small, almost apologetic smile. We didn't speak for a while. I simply sat near her, the letter lying between us like a bridge we weren't sure we were ready to cross. Every so often, her gaze would flick up at me, holding mine a fraction too long, like she wanted to say more but didn't have the courage. And then she finally leaned back, exhaling softly. "I thought I was done with all of it," she said. "I thought I'd buried it somewhere safe. But seeing you here, somehow, it just brought it all back." I reached for the letter instinctively, just enough to touch the edge. She didn't pull it away. Our fingers brushed slightly, accidental but electric, and I felt her body shift subtly toward mine, as if the tiniest acknowledgement could make the room collapse. She caught my gaze and held it, eyes glistening with something raw, regret, longing, maybe even fear. Then she shifted, resting her head briefly against my shoulder, just a fraction of contact, but enough to make the world feel off balance, fragile. I realized then that everything had changed, though nothing had been declared. That one quiet, unguarded gesture, leaning on me just slightly, carried more weight than words could ever manage. And for the first time, I understood. Some things shift without warning, and when they do, even the smallest movement can feel seismic. The evening settled like a soft weight around us. Mara and I were on the floor again, a mess of tools and papers scattered around the small repair project I had come to help with. But neither of us cared about the mess. The room smelled faintly of coffee and rain from earlier, the light dim and forgiving. She had been unusually quiet, but there was no tension in the silence this time. Only the kind that comes when two people finally stop pretending that everything is ordinary. I watched her move, slow and deliberate, and noticed the way her shoulders relaxed when she didn't think I was looking. "I don't know how we got here," she said quietly, voice almost lost in the hum of the city outside. I leaned back against the counter, letting my hands rest loosely on my knees. "Neither do I admitted, and the truth felt easier than any half-measure I'd been holding on to. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she sank to the floor beside me, close enough that our knees brushed without thought. There was a careful precision to her movements, a subtle caution that had been with her from the start. But now it felt different, less guarded, more accepting. For a while, we just sat like that. The room was small, intimate, yet somehow infinite in the way it held only the two of us. No words were necessary. We had already said everything worth saying in stolen glances, quiet sighs, and fleeting touches. Her hand shifted slightly, brushing against mine. Not a deliberate reach, not a declaration, but enough. Enough to make the silence heavy with everything we hadn't named, everything we had both been pretending to resist. I didn't move away. I let my fingers meet hers, tentative at first, then more naturally, as if they had always belonged there. "You're still here," she murmured, not a question, just an acknowledgement. "And you're still you." I replied softly, the words awkward and imperfect, yet exactly what I needed to say. She let out a short, almost breathless laugh, a sound I had memorized over countless quiet evenings, moments when she had allowed herself to falter just enough for me to notice. It was a fragile thing, but in that fragility, there was a strength neither of us could ignore. Our knees touched again. Her head leaned slightly toward mine, just a fraction, resting near my shoulder without any conscious thought. The contact was minimal, but it carried the weight of everything, of hesitations, of longing, of the slow unraveling of restraint that had bound us for weeks. We didn't need words. There was no grand confession, no dramatic declaration. The understanding between us was quiet, earned through small acts, shared silences, and the vulnerability we had allowed ourselves to show. For the first time, the tension that had defined our interactions felt complete, settled into a new rhythm. The pull between us was no longer impossible. It was inevitable, recognized, and accepted. I watched her relax fully for the first time, her fingers loosely entwined with mine. The quiet simplicity of it, the touch, the proximity, the unspoken acknowledgement, was enough. It was everything. And then she sighed softly, leaning just a fraction closer. I felt the warmth, the weight, and I knew that, for now, this was enough. No fireworks, no declarations, just shared space, understanding, and the gentle certainty of a connection finally allowed to exist. For the first time, it felt like something real. It's quiet now, later than usual, and I'm sitting at my desk with the city lights bleeding through the blinds. I still think about Mara, sometimes more than I probably should, but in a different way now. Less restless, less wondering what could happen, more aware of what already has. The days after that night with the dishwasher, the letters, the small touches that neither of us could, or wanted to, name, felt different. Something shifted quietly, almost imperceptibly. I learned to slow down, to notice the tiny, fleeting moments. The way someone's laugh can linger in your chest, or how a glance can carry a weight words never could. I found patience in myself I didn't know existed, and with it, a deeper understanding that love isn't always a fireworks display. Sometimes it's a whisper, a shared silence, the quiet permission to exist with someone without pretense. Mara changed too, though she'd never admit it. She moved with a little less armor, laughed with a touch more abandon, allowed herself to pause instead of pushing forward with practiced control. I could see it in the way she lingered near me sometimes, the subtle brush of her fingers against mine, the faint warmth she didn't try to hide. And every time I caught it, I felt the same slow, steady pull I had from the very beginning, like discovering a song you didn't know you'd been waiting for. We never called it love. We didn't need to. The word felt too heavy, too deliberate. What we had was something earned, fragile yet unshakable. It was in the quiet moments, the understanding that neither of us would walk away without a fight, but not because of obligation, because of recognition. We had chosen, in small ways, every day, to stay. Sometimes I think back to that first day at the repair shop, fumbling with a blender I didn't understand, watching her lean over the counter. I can still feel the spark that wasn't romance, not yet, but something else, something inevitable. It's strange how much weight a single glance can carry over months, how patience, observation, and hesitation can build something stronger than any declaration. And now, looking back, I realize that the story isn't about moments of drama or climactic confession. It's about all the quiet, stolen fragments that added up to a connection neither of us expected, but both of us needed. It's about the small gestures, the almost touch, the pauses and hesitations that finally led to this. Knowing someone so fully that you can exist together without the need to explain, justify, or rush. The memory of her hand brushing mine, her shoulder against mine, the way she finally let herself lean, still lingers. I smile softly at it now, not because it's perfect, but because it's ours, real, flawed, and human in the most beautiful way. And I think that's what matters most. Quiet acknowledgement, subtle understanding. The courage to stay even when everything else pushes you away. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?